You got no time now. When I say now, the future's past. Days go by. Here and now. Years go by. Here and now. Life goes by. Wonder how the time the future is. When I the say now, it's almost years go by. Years go by. Life goes by. You got no time now.
I'm being told by my director that I'm supposed to introduce myself and talk a little bit about who I am. And I said that's really difficult. Oh, and also why it's even worth anybody's time to watch these videos. And that's pretty difficult because it's pretty general and vague. So I told her that I would try and talk about me like we were on a first date and I was trying to tell her about my life. Except I'll probably be a little more honest than most guys would be on a first date. But that's okay because I already know her. Just this is all a fiction. And we're doing this in the middle of July in Sauk Center, Minnesota, just because it was basically the most fun thing we could think to do on a Saturday night in Sauk Center, Minnesota.
Little did he know that in the inside of my mind, while we were making these lovely videos, I had already figured out that I was going to put the videos together and somehow compile a documentary biography of this interesting and fascinating man.
My name is Chris Roman. I am 67 years old, having been born in December of 1947. To a couple who my understanding is my conception was their one and only coupling for reasons that I'll talk about later. But suffice it to say, it was not a good marriage. My parents were married. But I don't have any memory of living with my father, and he disappeared, I think, around the age of 2 or 3. I was born in Michigan. We went to Texas. The only early childhood memory I have is running around. There's even a video of it, which may be why it's a memory, of running around in front of this line of apartments with these 6 guns on. I remember I liked to play with 6 guns, as much as I hate guns now.
Okay, hello. I'm Suzanne and I'm here with Chris, and we're just having a conversation, and I have some questions for Chris. One is when we were talking earlier about your bio, being where you came from, and must have been very, very difficult with your mom and being sickly and stuff.
Yeah, but compared to people I've come to know in my life who had really bad childhoods, mine was almost a gravy train.
Do you think that it gave you a sense of compassion that you wouldn't have had otherwise?
I think it gave me a sense of wanting to be compassionate. I would always say, if I'm ever in this situation, I will never behave like this, in an aggressive or mean fashion. But I didn't feel it. It took me until growing into adulthood and practicing Buddhism that I came to actually feel the compassion. So it becomes a fuel. You got to have fuel to do anything.
When you had left, where did you leave from when you went to New York?
I left from Michigan. I had gone to Michigan to live with my dad for the last year of high school. I'd had a reasonably unpleasant youth in Chicago with my mother, and so I ended up in Michigan with my dad and finished my year up there, and then I went to Michigan State University for 2 years in Lansing because my high school grades weren't good enough to get me into the University of Michigan, which is the good school. Michigan State was, in those days, it was called the Farmers College.
Wow.
Yeah. So
what transpired to get you to New York? What was going on in Michigan?
Nothing. Michigan State was a terrible school. It was a terrible experience. I didn't want to be there. I was not an academic by any stretch of the imagination. I was a pretty confused person. Are we going to be showing the earlier tape?
At some point. That's important.
Well, I don't.
I
know
want
how
to know
much-
the transition right now today
Yes.
from Michigan to New York,
York.
and what that took, because it takes
That
an
took-
awful
that
lot.
took three things.
Okay.
The first thing was in October of 1966, Martin Luther King came to the Michigan State University, and he talked. And it wasn't really one of. At the time, I remember I kind of fell asleep during his talk because it was a little monotonous. Plus, he was speaking to a whole bunch of white kids who didn't get it anyway. But I remembered really understanding the injustice he was talking about during the speech, and I certainly remember my own feelings about the civil rights movement. Even though I wasn't an activist, I was certainly for it and didn't understand the whole racial thing anyway, other than maybe a slight variation or a big variation on what I had experienced. Yeah, but then about a month later, Timothy Leary came to Michigan State. And I'll always remember the very first thing he did. Now keep in mind, this is 1966 Michigan State University. And he puts his hands together and he bowed and he said, "Namaste." And then he said, for those of you not familiar with the word, it means "I salute the divinity within you." It actually has a much longer translation, but I'm real bad at memorizing it, so I'll have to repeat it somewhere down the line. But and then he talked about the philosophy, what he called tuning in and dropping out. You know, tuning into the reality of things, and then dropping out of the structure as it was being created in the real world.
So as he was talking to you that day, it hit a chord.
It
The
hit a
truth.
chord in that I knew I wasn't seeing the reality of my life. I knew I wasn't feeling authentic, but I didn't know what I was supposed to go toward. He had a reputation of doing LSD. He had done a lot of experimenting with LSD, and it was a national, I wouldn't say scandal, but it was a national news event in those days. People were criticizing him and his partner, Richard Alpert, who is now known as Ram Dass, and leads a major spiritual, meditative, Eastern, Buddhistic kind of a following in this country, who I have great respect for. I practice a different kind of Buddhism, but Ram Dass is a pretty amazing guy. So he and Timothy Leary worked together in those days at Harvard, but then they gained so much notoriety for their work in LSD, they were kind of asked to go, as I recall. I don't remember. But Timothy Leary inspired a lot of us to tune in and drop out, which is what I did 4 months later in February of '67. I was a little high on cough syrup with my friend Steve, who that day at age, now remember, it's 18, so that's old compared to now. He gave me my first taste of marijuana, which I kind of enjoyed, but like everybody else who smokes for the first time, you don't really think you're high. So, and then he said, "Let's go to New York." He had been to New York, and he said it was amazing, and painted verbal pictures for me of Greenwich Village and Bob Dylan, and just that it was really happening there. And so that night in 1967, we went from Chicago by bus. We went to my dorm room at Michigan State. I packed up just a suitcase full of things, and I left everything, including my live gerbil, which my dad never forgave me for. But you can tell I was a nerd. I had a gerbil, for God's sake. Everybody else my age had a girlfriend. I had a gerbil. So anyway, and then Steve and I went to Saginaw. There's that Paul Simon song, "It took me 3 days to hitchhike from Saginaw." I always think of that. I lived in Bay City, which is right next to Saginaw, but we went to the Saginaw Bank to get all the money I'd gotten for graduation the year before. It was like $800. And took it out of the bank, and unbeknownst to me, the bank called my father at work. This would have been on I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday, and they said, "Your son is in here taking all his money." And my father didn't know why, but he found out soon because I bought a ticket for me and Steve, and we went to New York, and by 3 days later we were living in a Lower East Side tenement in around 5th and C that cost $30 a month. It was on a 6th floor walk up, and inside had been painted yellow because the previous tenants wanted to feel like they were living in a banana.
How did you find God?
It was on a bad trip. It was on the bad trip that I took a friend David had given me too big a dosage, and then so I started hallucinating a lot, and not imaginary things. Hallucinating, at least for me with LSD, wasn't seeing things that weren't there. It was just seeing things with much more vibrant color and much more kind of around the boundaries. Things look like they're melting. David Braden in the book says that's because your senses are perceiving more, so you're actually seeing the energy of the boundary instead of the boundary itself. You're seeing more, so things keep changing when you're looking at them, and it's really, for the most part, quite beautiful. But he had given me too much LSD, and then he said, okay, let's take an acid trip. Well, these buildings in the Lower East Side are all 6- and 8-floor walk-ups, and they're all connected to each other. They're not separate spacing between. In the back where they're joined is called the air shaft. Our apartment, the Yellow Banana apartment, had all the windows facing the air shaft were broken, so we had natural ventilation, And so anyway, David and Steve and I all went up to the roof. David said, we're going to jump across the air shaft. Well, I am a physical klutz, being Jewish, and I will admit that I'm also a physical coward. I don't like pain. I had enough of that when I was little from my mother, so I don't see a whole lot of value in pain. Except that which does not kill me makes me stronger.
Right.
But he said, we're going to jump across the air shaft, and I could not do it. I was hallucinating so badly, and I was just terrified and paranoid. So that's when the trip started going bad, because I was so down on myself, which is a major thing I do anyway. And so Steve tried to lighten the atmosphere. He said, I know, let's all get on the subway and go to Staten Island and take the ferry across to Staten Island and watch the sunrise. And we all went, yay, So we all walked from the East Village over to the West Village to get on the Staten Island subway. And we went down to now I'm about an hour and a half into the trip, maybe 2 hours. Trips are usually about 12 hours long. So now I'm an hour and a half, 2 hours in, and we're down on the subway platform, and at that hour of night they were running express trains, which means they would go past that station and they wouldn't stop. And this probably happened 2 or 3 times. Well, when you're on LSD in a really heightened state and not in a good state to begin with, time and space get very expanded. So I literally felt like I had been on the subway platform and I'm not joking, it felt like 80 or 90 years, and that hundreds of trains had gone by. That was the hallucination, as it were. And I just freaked out. So when the next train was coming, I tried to throw myself in front of it, onto the tracks, because I wanted to end this terrible wait. And Steve moved around in front of me. He saw what I was doing, and he stopped me just as I was about to go off the edge and screamed in my face, you're on acid. Chris, you're on acid. You took LSD. Do you remember? And at that point, you're in such a state of ego loss, I barely remembered that my name was Chris. It was just this voice yelling at me. But he was also restraining me, so luckily I couldn't jump. So he said, look, this happens sometimes. People take so much acid they forget they're on acid, because it feels really real. I can't explain it. It feels very real. It's not like all woozy.
When you got done with that trip, what did you feel?
Well, see, that's the rest of the story.
Okay.
I have to talk to you about not when I got done, but while I was coming down, which was a process. Because what happened, so we got on the train, went to Staten Island, but unbeknownst to us, the trains didn't stop at that point in the morning because it was still too early and the ferry wasn't running anyway. So then again, I tried to throw myself onto the tracks.
Let me see, a second time?
A second time, yeah. I was going to throw myself on the tracks, and I actually opened the subway doors that were shut, and they're shut with metal arms. So, I had some adrenaline flowing. And he pulled me back again, and we finally got back to the West Village, and we got out of the station exactly where we'd gotten on, maybe 90 minutes earlier. And I had gone through this tremendous situation of trying to kill myself twice and having Steve save me twice. And then we walked from the West Village back to the East Village, and now I was coming down. And the first thing that happened is when I came out of the subway into the streets of New York, which at that time of the morning, it was getting to be dawn now, were just beautiful and peaceful and very few people on the street. And I saw, and this will be with me until I die, whether it's true or not, I saw what I can only describe now. It's been portrayed it looked like the Matrix, except it was alive. It wasn't a mechanical, digital driven.
It was breathing and living.
It was breathing and living, but it was just streams of energy, and it surrounded, and all the buildings were made up, and everywhere I looked, this is the entire. And you've seen scenes in New York. It's got a lot of buildings and a lot of stuff on the street, but everywhere I looked, it was this energy manifestation, or this energy manifesting into matter that I could see. I could see that there was so much more to the universe than the physical world, and I just knew that, So then, on the way back, and this is the crazy part, Steve first of all reminded me of the Tibetan Book of the Dead lyrics that the Beatles put in their song, "Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. This is not dying," and that's what you say to dying people or people who are transitioning. And then he quoted to me, for some reason he quoted to me from the Upanishads, which are Eastern spiritual teachings. And sorry, the cat is noisy. The cat is deaf, and that's why he's loud. So he read to me from the Upanishads, and we got back to the 6th floor walk up, and I went upstairs, and I went up to the roof where the whole thing had started with the acid test that I failed. And I looked to my left. I had this feeling of peace and understanding the oneness of things that I couldn't even conceive of. And then I looked to the left. No, I looked to the right, which I was facing, would have been north, so I was looking more towards the east side of Manhattan Island, where you could see tall buildings and even the river. And there, in my eyes, I saw rainbows and flowers, and it was pink and yellow, and that's what I was hallucinating, because I was feeling so good. And then I started to worry about what if this wasn't true, and what was going to happen when I came down and I couldn't experience this anymore, and I got myself into a funk. And I looked off to the left, and I saw a devastated landscape of New York, like it had been hit with a nuclear weapon.
Wow.
And I actually started going left, right, and doing negative, positive. And I was seeing two totally different things. And it felt really real. Let's see. So I just knew from that night on that there's a whole lot more to life than meets the eye.
Right.
And I determined that if the reality was what I saw when I came out of the subway, if the reality was this energy manifesting into matter and everything manifesting as a oneness, that if that's the reality of things, but life closes down, we come down from our trip, and life are important to us, our jobs, our family, our children, our communities, our churches, whatever it may be. So that's our life lived in the regular workaday world. And then there's this reality that I saw. So I remember I wrote just basically a piece of, I don't have it anymore, but I wrote that I was looking for a bridge. I was thinking there has to be a way to build a bridge from daily life into the reality of what really is. And that's when I started my quest. I started my quest for trying to find out how do you build that bridge to the ultimate reality.
And how old were you?
That point this would have been in March of 1967, so I was just short of being 20. I was 19.
Pretty young.
Yeah, I was young. And then it became a quest, which was really fascinating. I ended up, it's not famous, people usually heard of the Chicago 7, the hippie thing. They were all arrested at the Chicago Convention. Their lawyer was William Kunstler, and they were really trying to change society. A year earlier, Memorial Day on the Lower East Side, I was arrested at the Memorial day bust at Tompkins Square Park, which is the Lower East Side, because the cops came because we were sitting in a big circle smoking marijuana, and they came, and 2 girls down from me, the girl was pregnant, and the cop kicked her in the stomach, and we all got kind of angry and said, stop that. I mean, we were hippies, we weren't really very offensive. It wasn't a yippie type thing, you know. But, you know, we all got pretty much hit with police sticks and thrown in the Tombs of New York, which is the city jail. And then our lawyer was William Kunstler, who was also the lawyer for the Chicago 7 and became quite famous. He was a famous lawyer for liberal causes back then. I was arrested with Abby Hoffman, who was just an obnoxious loudmouth, and Jerry Rubin. I guess those are the main names that people would know from that time period. So I was kind of a little in the thick of it. I wasn't in the center of any kind of big political movement or anything.
But in the same sense, it seems to be the place, the spot in your life where you started to make some very clear, strong.
Yeah, I decided
decisions.
Things weren't really wrong. Were really wrong. I became very anti-Vietnamese War. I became very pro-civil rights. You know, I wasn't an activist per se because I didn't really want to go the political way, and besides, we were enjoying the hippie life too much, at least for about another year. But I did in November. No, it must have been September or October of '67. I did march on the Pentagon with the Armies of the Night, which is a book written by Norman Mailer, which recounts the protests that took place in Washington, D.C. against Vietnam. So I was part of that, and we got arrested there and thrown up in Quantico.
Okay, honey, are you going to tell me about what life was after New York?
What life was after New York?
Yeah. Well, what happened just before you left New York?
Well, I left New York twice.
Twice?
Yeah. I had gone there in February of '67, and all those things happened that I told you about, the acid trips and living with friends on the Lower East Side of New York. And I actually got a job. I mean, we did a lot of drugs and we were selling drugs, but I actually got a job on Madison Avenue. I was working in an advertising company, like the show Mad Men, except I was their token hippie. So I'd come to work with, you know, and they'd show their clients and say, see how chic we are? We got a hippie working here. But
Do you remember the job interview?
Well, actually, it was one nice thing my mother did for me. She gave me the name of a man she knew in New York. She had come to see me at the Plaza Hotel in New York, which was a really fancy hotel, and I went in with my Nehru shirt, and I went in there barefoot, and you don't do that at the Plaza, you know. But she gave me a name of a man, and I talked to the man, and they had a job for me, and so I did it. So I'd go from the Lower East Side to my job in advertising. But meantime, I'd had this spiritual awakening. I knew there was more to life than just, you know, working a job, you know. But New York was getting pretty crazy for me because I was doing too many drugs. And I actually left the advertising agency. I left a note on the Xerox machine that said, Shelley, that was my boss, Shelley, I'm hallucinating so much I can't read my charts. I have to take a break from this. And I left and I went...
How old were you?
This would have been 19. I would have been 19 years old. And I left and I went to my friend Steve, and we'd both been talking about leaving. This was in '67, yeah. And so we hitchhiked. We left New York and we hitchhiked. We were going to hitchhike back to Chicago because that was his home. And we hitchhiked into Michigan, and we were hippies, long hair, beards, and stuff like that. And we were going through, I don't know what it was, cutting through Michigan. I can't remember if it's Route 80 or whatever. You have to go down around Illinois. But anyway, we were hitchhiking through Michigan, and these state cops ran us off the highway and made us walk to the nearest town. It was like 5 or 6 miles away. So we walked north to this town. This was on a Saturday night. And we became the Saturday night date at the town because we ended up on the strip of the town, you know, where there were drive-ins and everything.
Main Street.
So, yeah, so all the kids from the high school would come and be pointing at the hippies and stuff. And then Steve and I slept under a trailer that night, and it was raining, and he caught pneumonia. I finally called my aunt and uncle in Washington, D.C., and I said, can you spot us bus money to get us into Chicago? And they said, yes, we will, if you come back to Washington, D.C. and spend some time with us. These were my most nurturing relatives, you know. So I thought, wow, I can do that. So that's what happened. And then I went back to Washington, D.C. But my uncle, who was a really nice guy and a lawyer at the National Labor Relations Board, wanted me to get work. And I was still in the, you know, the kind of hippie idea of I didn't want to just do a regular job. And he got me a job at the Pottery Barn. What's going on? So I got a job at the Pottery Barn that lasted one day.
What did you do at the Pottery Barn?
I did nothing because I only lasted 3 hours. What I did was I learned what a really fucking boring job this was going to be, and there was no way I was going to spend even a small portion of my life doing it. So yeah, I left, and then my uncle and I wanted to go back to New York and give it another shot. So I went back to New York in January of 1968. And actually, the funny part was I went back to New York. I found another apartment. Jim Wells, who you know, was moving out of an apartment he had. I had been at 5th and C, and this was at 7th and C. So, and it was a nice apartment. And this was, it would have been the very beginning of 1968, the end of 1967. So I'd been in D.C. for about 3 months, maybe 2. Went back to New York. Went back to the people who I quit the job on, and they hired me back. I couldn't believe it. They hired me back at a higher rate of pay because they still needed the token hippie or whatever, and I actually did good work for them there. We were supposed to judge why commercials were effective or why they weren't. So I'd get really high and then watch the commercial and I'd just go, oh wow, that's obvious why that's bad. But we tested it in front of people, so their results would come back and I would match their results with my own thinking on the commercial, and I would write why it was a good or bad commercial. So anyway, they took me back. The funny part was they didn't have an office for me. So I'll be damned if they didn't give me a corner office that a vice president had just let go of. And if you've ever seen Mad Men, where they had the 2 windows coming together and they could see the city, that was my office. The thing which is really most important is I was looking for a spiritual teaching. I never forgot the lessons of that acid trip. I never forgot the lessons of being interconnected. But the more I saw it, the more I felt like I was losing all connection with the world around me. I really didn't care very much about anything.
Could have been the drug use.
It could have been the drug use. It could have been my natural dysthymia, but at that point, depression. I would certainly think about killing myself, even though I never tried to again after those experiences on the bad acid. I was suicidal. And part of me, I had a really good friend named Marty Hurd, now dead, and his brother dead too, and he was the sweetest man I've probably ever known, and he was a heroin addict. And he was making heroin addiction looked very attractive to me, even though I never did more than really snort it, and I liked it. But I knew it was the opposite direction from where I wanted to go. I knew it was going to close me off instead of open me up to, as Aldous Huxley would say, the doors of perception, to a higher consciousness. So it was against that backdrop then that I left New York on the day Bobby Kennedy was shot. And my friend Gene, who I'd met up in New York, said, you've got to come to Washington, D.C. You got to come back to Washington. I've discovered this thing, and I've got to tell it to you. Well, what is it? Well, it'll sound silly over the phone. You just have to come back, and I'll tell you all about it. So, and she told me the Buddhist chant, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So I was down on Lake Michigan on the beach, and I was really depressed. It was almost like one of those A Star Is Born moment where I was considering walking into the surf and drowning myself or something. I was down there with my dog Lump, and it started to kind of thunder and lightning. And Lump, who was my steadfast companion and had been for 2 years, I don't know if I hallucinated or if it really happened, but he lunged at me, kind of snarling and trying to bite me. Well, he never did that. He was the world's most passive dog. So that happened, and it was thundering, and I was just thinking, I just got to end it all. And so I remembered the words that Gene had told me, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and I chanted them. And Lump backed off, and the storm came to an end, and the dawn began to break. And I thought, that's really pretty amazing, and so within a week I was on my way back to Washington, D.C., not to practice Buddhism or chant, but just to see my friend Gene, because I was looking at it as some kind of cosmic message. And so I got back to Washington, D.C., and that's when I started to learn about Buddhism. That would have been in September of 1968. This whole thing, this whole depression and everything, that was a huge part of it too. I'm forgetting that part. This was all taking place against the backdrop of the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention, where hippies and yippies, because that was the militant faction of the hippies, had inspired the ire of Mayor Daley and the Chicago police force. So they were getting beaten up and things in the streets.
Right.
And they weren't really friends of mine, but I thought, man, this is just the end of the movement. This is how it is. So
That was 1968.
this all happened in 1968, but what I'm saying is all of the depression I was going through, everything was in that summer of 68. I had just never ever been that down. So for Gene to call me and say I found this great thing, I was prime. I was prime for anything. I want to see Gene again anyway. So that's why I went to Washington, D.C. But literally, I went to Washington, D.C. about 2 weeks after that convention. Strangely, Jim Wells, went there 2 weeks before me because I had somehow talked to him. He'd never really spent any time in D.C. So he took my dog Lump, because I was disenchanted with Lump anyway since he got mad at me on the beach. So Jimmy took Lump in his Volkswagen bus.
Yeah.
And he drove off to Washington, D.C., and I ended up there about 3 weeks later, September of 68. Yeah.
Well, I know you're tired, so I will let you be. So you and Jim Wells and Gene Rosenberg all lived in where? Washington?
We all lived in Washington, D.C.
Together.
Yeah, first we had this, Gene, and I don't even remember, but Gene somehow had this luxury apartment on Connecticut Avenue. And they just moved in, and we only lasted there 2 weeks because we ended up having a party where some of us were sitting on the windowsill, strangling our feet out the window, and this was like 6 floors up, and the apartment owners didn't like that, so they kicked us out. Then we lived in a big haunted Russian house type place for several months. And then we lived, boy, I can't remember, lived at 23rd and M. That may have been the first place we lived. 23rd and M was a second floor apartment over a bodega, a Mexican-owned grocery store.
So when you went to Washington, is that when Gene had introduced you to Buddhism?
Gene said, come to Washington, I want to tell you about this amazing thing I'm in. She didn't even call it Buddhism.
Did she take days to tell you?
No,
Months?
no, she hit me with it as soon as I got there.
Okay.
And they tried to get me to chant, and I would chant a little bit, but I just thought it was alien and weird as hell, and I'd already been through the Hare Krishna thing. I'd already been with the various Om, Mani Padme. There's lots of chants I had tried. They all felt nice. They induced meditative states. I didn't spend money on transcendental meditation, but I really didn't have much use in my life for a chant.
Contrary to his last statements here, Chris joined a Buddhist organization, taught and lectured for the organization for more than 11 years. His story is not yet finished. It continues. No, you don't. Now, if you had anything to talk about or converse with the general public, what would it be about?
It would be about the need for people for people to stop using more resources, than they're giving
And
to the world, to the planet.
in what aspect?
Well, consumerism is one thing, but that's too shallow. It's people have this idea that we as a species have to grow instead of live with the other species on the planet and caretake the planet. Okay.
What
And
resource?
we have that kind of responsibility to the planet, but people, I'm not sure, recognize that.
What resources are you thinking of? Basically,
Well, I don't want
is
to
it
get into
all
specifics
resources?
Because I'm not a scholar.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about resources of, we eat way too much meat, for instance. The methane created by all the cows we've got is one of the greatest contributors to global warming. So just to eat, we could change our way of using resources. And certainly you saw that thing on 60 Minutes last night about rare earths.
Right.
Right? Those are resources. If we use them up in the short-term quest for technology and development and growth, when we really need them, they won't be there for us. We are using resources that are finite, that are limited.
Like we don't have another planet.
And we can't continue to do that and survive as a species. And this is what I'm always thinking about, is that our species' very survival depends not just on technological development, but on our spiritual evolution, because we have not evolved to the point that our technology is at. It passed us up 20, 30 years ago. And that's why you have things like, in my opinion, non-scholarly opinion, that's why you have things like Asperger's. That's why you have things like autism.
How does that affect those things?
My perception of it is, and I'm going to stress everything with it's just my opinion, but my perception of it is that, particularly with regard to autism and Asperger's, children are being born into a very different environment than they were born into 30 or 40 or even especially 50 or 60 years ago. We tend to think of ourselves as being people in our surroundings, but we're not people in one surrounding. We each have our own environment. Even in this room, there's two people. There's me. I'm looking at a cute blonde with a little cute dog and a growling cat behind her. And you're just looking at some old Jewish guy in front of a weird piece of art in an Amish fireplace. So we have two completely different environments that we're taking care of. And the environment you're born into is really important. When you and I watched I Love Lucy in the 1950s, she was doing slapsticky things, but the camera stayed on her for maybe 5 or 10 minutes while she and Ricky would talk, and usually it was just the two of them. And now, kids are born into a world where there's bam, 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 in terms of videos, in terms of video games, in terms of the fact that when we were watching our 3 channels of TV 50 years ago, there were 2 commercials in 2 minutes. And now it can be anywhere from 10 to 30 or even 40 commercials in a 2-minute space of time, because it's just such quick cuts. So everything in technology and our environment, which I was talking about before, is moving much faster at what's called nanoseconds. There's a wonderful book called Time Wars. We evolved to work in seconds. Computers and technology, and this is why that kind of affects your TBI too. Computers and technology, you can edit it out. Yeah, you got an editor. Anyway, I'm just saying, computers and technology are hitting us with so much. Your average child right now experiences more sensory input, light, movement, sound, everything else. In a day, he or she, like Juju or Tyler, probably experience 25 times what you and I experienced at their age. But genetically, they're not that far evolved. It's only 30 years. Everybody knows evolution takes place over thousands of years. You've got to evolve these things. And I personally believe that both autism and ADHD are evolution towards dealing with this new digital world that we're entering. But if they're evolution, then you've got to cultivate them and see where the dangers are and see where the health is. Don't automatically assume it's a bad thing just because your kid is unique and not appropriate, and badly behaved. Maybe because he sees a lot of badly behaving adults. My gosh, if I'm a kid and I can turn on the television set and I can watch a United States congressman threaten to throw a TV reporter off the balcony of the Capitol, don't try and tell me what's appropriate when grown-ups in my world at the highest level are doing those kinds of things.
Right.
So that's why I hate the word appropriate.
Devastation that all of this pollution and raping of the earth, do you think that there's a possibility that there'll come a time of enlightenment with that? That they will
I think people are already realizing that there is a growing consciousness of that fact. The problem is that we live in a world where 1% of the people own 90% of the stuff. You see what I'm saying? So no matter how great the consciousness is, how many millions and maybe even billions of people understand that we're in this predicament, there's a few hundred people, and I'm not talking conspiracies there. I'm just talking about the people who own everything.
Right.
Who literally own everything. So what there needs to be is a revolution. But my contention is that this needs to be a nonviolent revolution. I'm a Buddhist, and I'm with Gandhi, and it has to be a nonviolent revolution. But there's got to be a way to restructure the economy. One great way to start, and I'm hoping Bernie Sanders says it. The last time we had prosperity in this country, and it was a good model for prosperity in every country in the world, was back around the 1950s. And I'm not going to term it communism or socialism or capitalism, but in the 1950s, under Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, tax rates for the richest people were 75, 80, sometimes 90% of their income. And we had this amazing period of prosperity where we built the railroads and we built the highway system and we won World War II. And all that was coming because the richest people were taxed at really high amounts. And that was fine, because how much money do you need to live? And there's not a billionaire in the world that works 1,000,000 times harder than the people that work for him. And yet 1 billion is 1,000,000 times 1,000. So the fact is, he's fighting with the cat. So that was a time of great prosperity. The great damage came with Ronald Reagan. Rates had already been cut, but with Ronald Reagan, all the rich people only got taxed at less than 40% or 30%, and it's been going downhill for 30 years. So more than half of the money that used to go to run the country, bad or good, government agencies are messed up. We all know they're run by bureaucrats, and some are good and some are bad. But it's not a waste of money, because those government agencies are working for the common good of all Americans. But what's happened is now all that money has come out, especially out of social services. And it shouldn't even be. I mean, that money should be providing health care. It shouldn't be a private corporation kind of thing. Wait, turn it off, because you're getting really distracted, and that's distracting me.
I'm sorry. No, I'm with you. It's just the kids in the yard.
Well, it's a neighborhood. We live in a neighborhood.
You want to talk through the growls of the dogs?
I don't care. I'm more reacting to your arms.
I'm sorry.
So I forgot the question.
I was wondering about the timing of people's enlightenment, of all the raping of the resources.
Now, and I think a revolution has to happen, and I would like a peaceful revolution, although in any revolution people get hurt.
Right.
I would like to see the rich people get hurt, because they've been hurting a lot of people for a long time. I'd really like to see karma come around. I'd really like to see them. I think people like that guy last night, and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates They get it. A lot of them get it. But most of the ones, those ones who even make those people look poor, those ones who are at the top 1%,
Right,
who owns
right.
like the 80 or 90%, and they're there thinking that that's God's gift to them. That if they weren't so righteous, they wouldn't have all this wealth and all this power. So they're operating from pure conviction that they've got the right way of doing things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have all this power and all this money. The reality is, it's power and money that's created over lifetimes, but they don't see that because I'm a Buddhist, and they generally think in terms of heaven and hell, and accumulate as much material stuff as you can in a single lifetime, which is just a silly way of
Self-entitlement.
living. Well, but they believe it. They
Yes.
believe they're good. They believe they're the best. They believe they're chosen. That's why the Jews got in so much trouble, speaking as a Jew, and that's why the Japanese got in so much trouble too, because Japanese people believed they were chosen by the sun goddess. You know,
But you do see it's starting now.
I see the consciousness starting now, but it was starting in the 60s
Do you
too.
think-
It was starting in the 60s too. But too many people co-opt themselves because you had to live. You had to make a living. You had, you know, and now our kids don't even know how they're going to make a living because the options have become so limited. You know, and they're the ones who are going to be at the forefront of the revolution. And I hope a lot of it's just on in cyberspace. Do you have any idea the chaos that would be created if major computer systems were disrupted? You
I
know,
think I can figure that out.
there's a great movie, it's everybody knows, it's called Fight Club. And the whole notion of Fight Club is about they figure out a way to blow up all the credit agencies. And they do. But just, you know, things like that, all this stuff that's so easily hackable, this whole thing could fall apart tomorrow with the right kind of coordinated cyberspace attack. You know, and that's what has to happen. It's not against a country. It has to happen against the entitled, the wealthy. You know, take down their systems. And then people will be, it'll really be hard, because then people will be, you know, like a town like this, we probably have to figure out what are we going to barter. Because the economic system can fall apart in a heartbeat. You know what I'm saying? I mean, does it make sense what I'm saying? You know, so I think that's going to happen. You've always heard me preach not doom and gloom, but I've always said there had to be a culling of the herd.
Right.
There, you know, where the earth is full, we can't have any more babies, and I know that really offends everybody who loves babies and thinks children are really important.
Yeah, they
and
are.
all the rest of it. Yeah, they really are. But right now, if they're so damn important, why don't we make a better world for the ones that are already here instead of just
Exactly.
making more? You know, there's no reason with birth control why you need to make more babies. You know, and let people who really want a baby, yeah, fine. But this thing, but the great thing is too, you know, where the best birth control is where the women are the most educated. That's where you get the population to come down. And that's why I can't figure out even what makes a woman a Republican. I cannot for the life of me figure out why any woman votes Republican, but it may be that their husband beats them into it, either psychologically or physically. I mean, I don't understand how women can't look at Republicans and go, my God, they're out to take away every right I've got. Or workers,
Right.
you know, they're going to take away every labor union, which before Ronald Reagan, this all started with Reagan, and it was all part of a plan, a really big plan, to take over the United States for at least 100 years, if not longer. But part of it really involved doing away with unions. 38% of the American workforce was in unions. Were unions bad? Yeah, Jimmy Hoffa was a bad guy, and there were corrupt union officials. But by and large, unions gave workers the power to get what they needed from the wealthy people to be able to buy their stuff. You know, 38%, I believe it was. Again, I'm not a scholar. That's before Reagan. You know what the union membership rate is in the United States today?
No.
Seth Walker is real dangerous on that one. But anyway, I don't even remember what the question was. Are people
It's
gaining
okay.
the consciousness? And
Yes,
yeah, I
yeah.
think they are. But they're helpless. They're helpless.
They
It's
need
either there has to be a revolution. There's one other way. There's one other way. Everything could change, and it's the one I pray for. Aliens.
All right, Mr. Roman. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss on this clip?
Yeah, you're asking the question. No, this is fine.
All right.
I'll be interested to see if you get 20 usable seconds out of that.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Days go by, here and now. Years go by, here and now. Life goes by. Wonder how the time future is. When I say now, it's almost. Years go by, years go by. Life goes by, here and now. When I say now, the future's past. Days go by, here and now. Years go by, here and now. Life goes by. Wonder how the future is. When I say now, it's almost. Years go by, years go by. Life goes by, here and now. When I say now.